It's a hot summer day in Spain in July 1936. The first shots of the Spanish Civil War were just fired. Around the country, Spanish military units have to choose between defecting to the nationalist uprising or fighting for the Republic. Most choose the former. Eastern and northern Spain, regions that heavily voted for CETA in the 1936 election, are the first to join the revolt. Spanish Morocco was quickly seized by General Franco. Franco isn't the only leader of the nationalists. General José Sanjurjo and General Emilo Mola were also chief architects of the military coup. However, both die shortly into the war in airplane crashes, leaving General Franco as the de facto nationalist leader. Justifying the revolt, Franco issues a manifesto. In it he proclaims, "Anarchy reigns in most of the countryside and towns. Government-appointed authorities encourage revolts. Revolutionary strikes of all kinds paralyze the life of the nation, destroying its source of wealth and creating hunger, forcing working men to the point of desperation. The most savage attacks are made upon national monuments and artistic treasures by revolutionary hordes who obey the orders of foreign governments with the complicity and negligence of local authorities." The nationalists had made their move. Now it was time to back it up on the battlefield. As news spread through Republican territory of what was occurring, things took a turn for the brutal. As I mentioned in part 1, the Republic had armed the workers to withhold the initial coup in Madrid. But it wasn't just the workers who were given arms. It was also the criminals and the dangerous. In some cases, jails were opened and their prisoners led onto the streets. This, added to the already bloodthirsty attitude of the communists, created a deadly combination. They didn't plan to just use their arms against soldiers. They quickly turned them on anyone in Republican territory they deemed to be an enemy. This led to a series of executions and massacres throughout Republican Spain known as the Red Terrors. During these atrocities, business owners, Catholic priests, nuns, and anyone deemed sympathetic to the nationalist cause was dragged into the street and shot without trial. The treatment of clergy was considered especially heinous. Many clergy weren't simply killed, but tortured. The graves of nuns were dug up and their bodies put on public display as a demoralization tactic. Pope Pius XI responded to the attacks by issuing an urgent papal encyclical, Divini Redemptoris. In it, he called atheistic communism a threat to all of Christian civilization. Ultimately, these Red Terrors actually hurt the Republican cause as they created immense destruction in their own territory. They murdered many of the most productive and well-to-do members of the Spanish community. By the end, even the leader of the Socialist Party, Indalecio Prieto, made a radio broadcast demanding the violence to stop. But by then it was already too late and the damage had been done. As news of the event spread to the international community, public opinion turned against the Republic. On top of all this, it also fueled a crusader-like zeal in the nationalist side, as they now viewed Republicans not as just political opponents, but as their mortal enemies. Now at this point, I should probably explain why Catholicism and communism were so at odds with each other. This won't be a total breakdown, that would need its own video, but it'll give a good idea. While Catholicism and communism share a few minor similarities, such as advocating justice for the working class, in totality, they have irreconcilable differences. Let's look at communism first. At the root of this conflict is the fact that communism is not merely a system of economics, it's an entire philosophical worldview. In this worldview, material conditions matter more than any kind of spiritual or moral issues. Humans are viewed as nothing but matter, and there is no afterlife. Every social structure that exists, marriage, the family, religion, are the result of arbitrary material events, so can be abolished at will. From this, communists believe that all hierarchy should be ended and power is to be wielded by the collective mass of people. Class struggle and revolution take on a messianic nature that communists believe will bring about a utopian world where everyone is equal. Communism believes that any kind of violence is justified to bring about this supposedly inevitable utopia. In practice, of course, none of this ever happened. Communist revolutions merely succeeded in destroying a traditional ruling class and installing a new atheistic one. Now, let's look at Catholicism. Catholicism is also an entire worldview through which all things are filtered. It views spiritual and moral issues as more important than material conditions, the opposite of communism. Humans are not merely seen as matter, but as eternal souls who will spend their afterlife in either heaven or hell. Catholicism calls for generosity to the needy as a virtue, but not for class struggle or class antagonism. The Catholic Church even acknowledged many of the abuses against the working class by industrialists, but it rejected communism's solutions as a deception. Catholics also believe in hierarchy and divinely instituted authority in roles like parents and clergy. Marriage and the family are not merely arbitrary institutions, but ordained by God. The mass collective has no right to tamper with God's design. So from this, I think you all see the areas where these two belief systems collide. It was only natural that communists and people of religious faith would despise each other. Spain in the 1930s found itself the battleground of the latest iteration of this struggle. While fighting began to rage through Spain, other countries announced their intentions. Some chose neutrality. France quickly announced a policy of non-intervention and closed its Spanish border. Meanwhile, the United States banned the export of weapons to Spain. But other countries chose direct involvement. Italy and Germany quickly recognized the nationalist government as legitimate and sent military aid. On top of furthering their geopolitical interests, the war was seen as an opportunity to practice the new art of air warfare. It would be German aircraft that flew General Franco to the Spanish mainland from Morocco. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and Comintern prepared their own intervention. They created the International Brigades. These were volunteer units from around the world who would be deployed to Spain to fight for the Republicans. They were heavily advertised as going to fight fascism and could perhaps be described as the original Antifa. Around 60,000 were ultimately sent. The Soviet Union also sent tanks and members of the NKVD secret police to aid the Republicans. Now you might ask what the Spanish Republicans were giving the Soviets for all of this aid. They did so by transferring 70% of Spain's gold reserves, worth hundreds of millions, to the Soviets. This caused critics in the United Kingdom, who had also declared neutrality, to believe this made Republicans the puppets of Joseph Stalin. Around this time, Lord of the Rings writer John Tolkien was one of many to throw moral support behind the nationalists. All of this shows us one major factor in winning a civil war: getting international help. The aid given to the nationalists by Germany and Italy proved much more decisive than the aid given to the Republicans by the Soviets. The German and Italian air attacks in particular proved devastating to the Republican forces. Ultimately, for the Republicans, the combination of being seen as the puppets of the Soviets and enemies of religion crippled their reputation and made it much harder to get international support. However, winning a civil war comes down to much more than just international support. Another major factor is unifying the factions on your side. The nationalist faction was ideologically diverse. While Marxist ideologies developed around the concept of class struggle, other ideologies were developing around class collaboration. One of these factions was the Falange Española, the Spanish Phalanx, a new movement on the Spanish right. Founded by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, its aim was a united Spain that would embark on a campaign of national rejuvenation. This was to be achieved through dictatorship and major economic reforms. It was not conservative, but revolutionary, much like the fascist movement in Italy. The Phalangist Manifesto, the 27 points, laid out their primary aims. They sought a one-party state, an economy based on national syndicates, and nationalization of the financial system with a ban on usury. Antonio Primo de Rivera declared the essence of what Falangism sought to do.
Spain has fallen on hard times due to a threefold division. Division engendered by local separatism, division engendered between political parties, and division engendered by class struggle. When Spain finds a common goal which overcomes all these differences, Spain will be great, like in its heyday.
The Phalange's ideology was much more innovative and similar to fascism than any other movement on the Spanish right. It was quite different from even Franco's worldview, who was more of a traditionalist, and justified the rebellion primarily as a way to bring law and order back to Spain. The Falange was banned months before the war by the Popular Front government, but it saw its ranks swell massively after the war started. It went from a meager few thousand into the hundreds of thousands. In the end, over 150,000 Phalangists fought for the nationalist cause. Unfortunately for the movement, most of its leaders were executed by the Republicans within weeks of the Civil War beginning. These killings backfired as Primo de Rivera became a martyr and icon to Spanish nationalists. Another faction that joined the nationalists were the Carlists, a hardline Catholic monarchist faction. They had already been fighting the liberalization of Spain for over 100 years, so fighting republicanism and communism was just another day for them. The Carlists have a long and complicated history, but the simplest way to explain them is that they favored another royal line within the House of Bourbon, and they dreamed of Spain returning to absolute monarchy. I've seen historians describe them as having a medieval worldview. Besides these ideological factions, the nationalists were also composed of military officers, church officials, and the Spanish business class. As time went on, more and more joined them simply because they were anti-communist. It fell on Franco to unite these diverse forces into a cohesive unit. He began by merging the Falangists and Carlists into a single movement, the Falange Española Tradicionalista. This was done despite major philosophical differences between the two groups. Franco also appointed himself as the new party's leader. From there, the nationalists adopted the slogan, "One state, one country, one chief." Franco himself did not have a revolutionary ideology, but was more of a standard monarchist. As time went on, he became mainly a pragmatist. His goals, above all else, were to end communist and Masonic influence in Spain, protect the Catholic Church, and revive Spain on the world stage. The nationalist side's ability to keep the distinct groups within its coalition from infighting would prove a key factor to its success. But while the nationalists found ways to achieve unity among their groups, the Republican side struggled. From the outset of the war, they suffered several schisms. The communists, anarchists, and liberals were frequently at each other's throats. As soon as the Soviet Union got involved, it tasked the central leadership of the Republic with wiping out those in their ranks who preferred Leon Trotsky, the arch-rival of Stalin. Shortly into the war, the leadership of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, pro-Trotsky communists, were arrested and tortured to death by Republican authorities. But it by no means stopped there. Trade unions and anarchists launched their own revolt in Catalonia that fought both sides. Revolutionary Catalonia, as it came to be known, is a source of much admiration of many leftist groups today. This is in spite of the fact that it actually cost the Republican side greatly and was eventually crushed. As you can imagine, all of this inner conflict and sabotage would cripple Republican efforts for the rest of the war. In the first few months of the war in 1936, the nationalists struck hard and fast. They began by liberating cities where the military garrisons had joined their side. The most famous of these came in Toledo, where the pro-nationalist garrison took refuge in the ancient Alcazar fortress. A fierce siege ensued for months, and Republican troops couldn't dislodge the garrison. Franco eventually arrived and lifted the siege, scoring a major propaganda victory for the nationalist cause. Franco could now credibly style himself as the savior of Spain, and the heroic effort by the garrison set the standard for the nationalist troops around the country. But it wouldn't be so easy in other cities. In Madrid, the military garrison was massacred by Republican militias. By the time the nationalists arrived to try to take the city, they were stopped by a massive Republican force bolstered by the international brigades. Instead of a speedy capture of the city, Franco had to settle for a lengthy siege. While the troops set up their positions, he turned his focus on capturing the other Republican-held regions in Spain. In 1937, the nationalists launched a northern campaign that saw them swiftly capture the Republican-aligned Basque region. This region was important due to its rich industry and minerals. The capture of the Basque capital Bilbao effectively ended the war in the north. This campaign saw the sloppy bombing of Guernica by German and Italian aircraft, which led to the deaths of hundreds of civilians. Historians dispute how intentional these deaths were, as aerial bombing was still an extremely new method of warfare, and there was heavy fog on the day of the bombing. Regardless of these factors, the aircraft did aid in a quick nationalist victory. By this time, throughout Spain, it was clear that Republicans were on the back foot and were losing city after city, town after town. Republicans now decided they had to re-seize the initiative. To do this, they launched an attack on the Aragon front to break a salient created by the nationalists. This resulted in the 3-month Battle of Turiel. After intense fighting with over 150,000 combatants involved, the Republicans were able to take the town. But this victory was short-lived. Nationalist reinforcements, led by Franco, eventually arrived and retook the town. This battle proved extremely costly for the Republicans, as on top of its failure, they lost many of their best troops and equipment. Franco would waste no time and a month later reach the Spanish coast, cutting off Catalonia and threatening Valencia. Republican territory was now split in two, and they would have to resort to increasingly desperate tactics to turn the tide. As the war raged on, the Catholic Church would receive justice against those who persecuted it. The conflict was taking on the character of a crusade against all godless forces in Spain. The Archbishop of Zaragoza declared the war was for the benefit of order, the fatherland, and religion. The Bishop of Pamplona denounced Azana's government as the enemies of God and Spain. The war was no longer just about a system of government. It became a spiritual, civilizational struggle. Many bishops declared the Nationalists as having met St. Augustine's requirement for just war. If you'd like to learn more about just war theory, watch this video. The Republic and communism were condemned as an earthly city of those without God. In a majority Catholic country, these moral condemnations had a lot of weight, and they no doubt increased the nationalist determination. In the summer of 1938, Republicans tried to reconnect their territory and gathered their largest army yet. They attacked the nationalist forces along the Ebro River, hoping to break and surround them. Unfortunately for the Republican side, they lacked air support, armor, heavy artillery, and had to make a dangerous river crossing. The Nationalists, knowing victory here meant breaking the back of the Republican army, dug in and engaged in a battle of attrition. After 5 months of battle, the Republican side suffered egregious losses and were driven back. Estimates put Republican losses at 15,000 to 30,000 to the Nationalists' 6,000. This outcome opened the way for the Nationalists to take Catalonia and its most important city, Barcelona. The war by now had all but been decided in favor of the Nationalists. All that was left was clearing up the pockets of Republican resistance. By this time, the international brigades were all withdrawing from the country. Famous British writer George Orwell was among the volunteers who left. While strongly against the nationalist cause, over the course of the war he became dismayed at the dysfunction and backstabbing in the Republican leadership. When he first came to Spain, he naively believed he would find a virtuous anti-fascist movement. This turned out to merely be a fantasy constructed by the international press. When he finally departed from the country, he lamented how the so-called progress he imagined for Spain never materialized. What he left behind was a Republican faction that wasn't long for this world. The Nationalists now made their final advances. Barcelona, already weakened by infighting between the Republican government and the anarchist trade unions, fell in January. The city was in such poor shape that many welcomed the Nationalists as liberators. Only Madrid and a few other strongholds remained loyal to the Republican forces. In February, both the United Kingdom and France recognized Franco's government. Knowing that he had won the war, Franco now slowed down and decided to completely break the will of the Spanish left. During the final siege of Madrid, Franco stated he would rather completely destroy the city than leave it to the Marxists. The city was finally captured on March 28, 1939, and Franco declared victory on April 1st. Mass arrests and tribunals of those who had supported the Republican side followed. Some Marxists were even studied by Franco's psychiatrists to see what mental traits made them become Marxist. The research determined that Marxism tended to attract people who were psychologically and morally degenerate. Former President of the Republic Manuel Azana fled to France and died a year later in 1940. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Spain was at peace. As the dust settled from the war, Spain was a battered nation. Over 500,000 people had died. Economic recovery would take years. Under the new nationalist government created by Franco, political parties, Freemasons, communists, and similar groups were all banned. Voting was limited to rare circumstances. Catholicism was once again made the state religion, and clergy were given back many roles in Spanish society. Franco would rule Spain as its dictator for 30 years, dying in 1975. By then, Spain had re-emerged as a stable and prosperous nation. Franco's legacy as a leader remains controversial to this very day. If you want my personal opinion, I think he did what he had to do. The Second Spanish Republic had completely failed in providing the most basic duties of a state. It had attempted to throw major parts of Spanish culture in the trash can. its politics had also turned the people against each other in vicious and homicidal ways. By contrast, the new Spanish government pursued Falangist ideals of national unity. Still, Franco's government couldn't be called a full-fledged Falangist state. This is because many of the anti-capitalist and fascist-like goals of the original Falange were watered down. Some point to this as the main reason that Spain became a republic again after Franco's death. Regardless of our views though, one thing is for certain. Franco and the nationalist faction won the war and prevented Spain from suffering the same fate as France in 1789 and Russia in 1917. That is a historic accomplishment.